The winter of 1878 swallowed all sound but its own. Frost crackled across window panes like hungry fingers. Wind moaned through ponderosa pines. And in a cabin perched at the edge of Whitetail Valley, a woman named Sarah Blackwood lived alone, with memories and silence as her only companions. She never expected to find a dying man in the snow. She never expected the town would force her to marry him. And she certainly never expected that this arrangement born of necessity would teach her that love isn't something you can bury with the dead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Whitetail Valley wasn't a place that forgave weakness. Tucked between the jagged teeth of the Colorado mountains, it demanded strength from those who chose to stay. The land itself seemed to test the resolve of settlers with winter storms that buried cabins to their window sills and summer droughts that turned creek beds to dust. Most who came seeking prosperity moved on within a year, but Sarah Blackwood remained. Her cabin stood like a defiant fist against the wilderness, perched on the edge of dense forest where few dared venture after dusk. Smoke spiraled from the stone chimney in thin, determined wisps that dissipated into the vast sky. From a distance it looked fragile, temporary, a human trinket the mountains might crush at any moment. Up close, it stood sturdy, chinked with moss and clay, roofed with hand-split shingles, weathered to the color of old bones. At 34, Sarah moved through her days with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that survival required ritual. Each morning before dawn, she stoked the cook stove until the iron belly glowed. She fetched water from the creek that never fully froze, breaking the skin of ice with practiced strikes of her axe handle. She fed her animals, a stubborn mule named Patience, 6 chickens, and a milk goat called Eleanor. She mended, she chopped, she hunted when necessary. She preserved what the land offered in seasons of plenty. Her hands told stories her mouth never shared, calloused palms, scarred knuckles, fingernails worn to the quick. They were hands that had buried a husband 3 years prior, hands that had dug post holes and skinned game and birthed calves. They were hands that rarely rested. The townsfolk of Whitetail Junction spoke of Sarah in hushed tones over whiskey at Henderson's saloon. Some called her touched by grief. Others suggested she was unnatural for a woman to live so far out with no man. A few of the kinder souls brought preserves or offered to send their sons to help with her heavier chores. Sarah accepted the preserves with a tight smile and politely declined the sons. Blackwood's widow has more pride than sense, declared Henry Wilson, the town's self-appointed mayor. She'll freeze or starve before she admits she can't manage that place alone. But Sarah didn't freeze, and she didn't starve. The first year after John's death had been the hardest, waking to the crushing weight of emptiness beside her, reaching for him in sleep, hearing the phantom creak of his boot on the porch. She'd survived that hollow time not through hope, but through stubbornness. Some days it was spite alone that pulled her from bed, a refusal to let Whitetail Valley claim another Blackwood. On the rare occasions when she rode into town for supplies she couldn't produce herself, Sarah felt the weight of glances. The single men between 20 and 60 would straighten their backs when she entered the general store. The married women would find reasons to strike up conversations that inevitably circled toward eligible bachelors. Children stared openly, as if widowhood had transformed her into something mysterious. "You know Tom Creedy's been asking after you," Dorothy Mills told her one afternoon, as Sarah selected needles from the notions drawer. "His farm's doing well, 2 hired hands now. And talk of expanding." Sarah smiled without showing her teeth. "Tell Tom I appreciate his interest, but I'm managing fine." "Managing isn't living, Sarah," Dorothy persisted, lowering her voice. "John wouldn't want you alone out there forever." Something flashed in Sarah's eyes then. not anger, but a weariness beyond her years. John doesn't want anything anymore. Dorothy, that's what dead means. She'd paid for her purchases and left, the bell above the door chiming a hollow farewell. On the ride home, she'd let Patience set a meandering pace as snowflakes began to swirl. The truth was, she didn't mind. The solitude. After years of John's constant talk, his plans, his dreams, his complaints, silence had become its own companion. Sometimes she would sit by the fire and realize hours had passed without a single word spoken. The revelation didn't frighten her as it once might have. Her cabin had taken on her shape like a well-worn glove. She'd built shelves where she wanted them, planted herbs outside the kitchen window, strung dried flowers from rafters. There were still echoes of John, the rifle rack he'd crafted, the rocking chair he'd ordered from back east as a wedding gift, but they were memories now, not wounds. Winter arrived early that year. By late October, the mountains were already capped with white, and the mornings dawned brittle with frost. Sarah prepared methodically, as she did all things. She stacked cordwood in the lean-to until it reached the rafters. She smoked venison and trout. She gathered pine nuts and berries. She mended blankets and stuffed draft stoppers with chicken feathers. She'd learned from past mistakes, and this year she would not be caught unprepared when the heavy snows came. What she couldn't prepare for was the storm that blew in from the north 2 days before Thanksgiving. It descended without warning, turning midday to dusk within hours. The wind screamed against the cabin walls like something wounded and vengeful. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in stinging pellets that accumulated faster than Sarah had ever witnessed. By morning, drifts had buried her woodpile and threatened the barn roof. Patches of ice formed on the inside of her windows. The animals huddled together, breath clouding in the bitter cold. Sarah knew she had to act quickly to clear paths or risk being truly trapped. She bundled in layers, woolen leggings beneath her skirt, John's old sheepskin coat, a scarf wound twice around her face until only her eyes remained exposed. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she pushed open the door. The sky hung low and grey, promising more snow by afternoon. Sarah worked steadily, shoveling paths. To the outhouse and barn, breaking ice from the water trough, checking the animals. Her fingers grew numb despite thick gloves. Her breath crystallized on her eyelashes. She was halfway back to the cabin, arms loaded with wood, when she heard it. A sound so unexpected that at first she thought it was the wind playing tricks. A low moan, human and pained, carried from the direction of the forest edge. Sarah froze, straining to listen over the whistle of wind through bare branches. There it came again, unmistakable now. A cry of distress. Sarah dropped the wood and reached instinctively for the knife at her belt. Living alone had taught her caution. It could be a trap. There were still men who preyed on isolated homesteads, who used the guise of injury to gain entry. But something in that sound, its raw desperation, pulled at her. She moved carefully toward the tree line, eyes scanning the white landscape. At first, she saw nothing. Then, nearly hidden in a hollow between fallen logs, half buried by drifting snow, she spotted a dark shape that didn't belong among the winter-bare trees. A man lay sprawled on his side, one arm stretched out as if reaching for help that hadn't come. His clothing was unlike anything worn in Whitetail Junction, fringed buckskin leggings, a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork now matted with frozen blood, moccasins instead of boots. His skin was copper brown where it wasn't mottled with cold. His black hair hung in long braids adorned with small silver bands. Even in his unconscious state, his features were proud. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a strong jaw now slack. With pain, Sarah didn't move, her mind racing. She recognized what he was immediately, Apache. The word formed in her mind not as a name, but as a warning, shaped by years of frontier stories and newspaper accounts of raids on settlements. The army had been pushing them further south for years, but occasionally small bands ventured north, especially during hard winters. Cautiously, she knelt beside him. A dark stain spread across his left side, frozen now but clearly blood. Beneath him, the snow had melted and refrozen into a crimson crust. He'd been shot, recently by the look of it. Perhaps by soldiers, perhaps by settlers, perhaps by rival tribesmen. The how didn't matter as much as what it meant. This man was dying, and if she left him, the bitter night would finish what the bullet had started. The sensible thing, the thing anyone in Whitetail Junction would advise, was to walk away. Let nature take its course. One less Indian was one less threat to settlements like theirs. She imagined what Tom Creedy would say, or Reverend Schultz, or Dorothy Mills with her pinched, proper face. They'd call it God's will, they'd call it justice. But Sarah's father had been a doctor before consumption took him, and some of his teachings had sunk deep. Life was life, he'd told her. Pain was pain. The body didn't know politics or prejudice or frontier fears. It only knew survival. As she hesitated, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were dark as wet river stones, unfocused at first, then sharpening on her face with sudden intensity. Neither fear nor pleading filled those eyes, only a steady, assessing gaze that seemed to look through her. His cracked lips moved, forming words in a language she couldn't understand. Then, with effort that made him wince, he switched to broken English. "Kill me. Quick." His hand moved weakly toward the knife at his own belt. "Not slow." The request jolted through her. He thought she'd come to finish him off, and why wouldn't he? A white woman finding a wounded Apache this close to a settlement. What other outcome could he expect? Sarah stood abruptly, taking a step back. She could still leave. No one would ever know. The storm would cover him by morning, and spring would reveal only bones, if anything at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'm not going to kill you." His eyes narrowed, confusion replacing resignation. "Can you stand?" she asked, knowing the answer even as she spoke. He'd lost too much blood, been exposed too long to the merciless. Cold. He made no response beyond a slight shake of his head. Sarah weighed her options, none of them good. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't move him alone, and she couldn't bring help without risking his immediate execution by the men of Whitetail Junction, who still spoke with bitter pride of the Indian problem they'd helped solve years ago. When the territory was first settled, with the decision came clarity. She would need the travois she used for hauling large game, something to leverage him onto it, blankets, water, her father's old medical bag with its rusty instruments and tinctures of questionable potency. "I'll be back," she told him. "Don't. Try to move." A flicker of something, surprise, suspicion, crossed his face before he closed his eyes again, whether from weakness or acceptance she couldn't tell. Sarah raced back to the cabin, her mind already cataloguing what she would need. This wasn't charity or kindness driving her, she told herself. It was simply what her father would have done, what any decent person would do for a suffering creature. It didn't mean she wasn't aware of the risk, to herself, to her standing, in the community that already viewed her with a mixture of pity and wariness. If anyone discovered she was harboring an Apache warrior, wounded or not, there would be consequences she couldn't begin to predict. But as she gathered supplies with shaking hands, Sarah realized with startling clarity that she feared the consequences of walking away far more than those of helping. Some decisions aren't made with the mind, but with the compass of the soul. This was one of those moments, arriving without fanfare, yet carrying the weight of everything that would follow. And Sarah Blackwood, who had survived loss and loneliness and the brutal indifference of mountain winters, faced it with the same quiet resolve that had become her signature in a world that demanded nothing less. Getting him to the cabin nearly broke her. The travois Sarah fashioned from pine saplings and rawhide groaned under his weight. Every step through the deepening snow felt like wading through molasses, her legs burning with effort, lungs searing in the frigid air. Twice she stumbled to her knees, and twice she forced herself back up, hands raw inside her gloves. The Apache remained unconscious, which was mercy. She didn't want to hear those words again. "Kill me quick," spoken with such resigned certainty. By the time she dragged him through the cabin door, darkness had fallen completely. Sarah's arms trembled from exertion as she built up the fire, casting urgent shadows across the small room. She worked methodically, stripping away his frozen outer garments with clinical detachment. The wound in his side was ugly, a through-and-through bullet hole, the entrance puckered and swollen, the exit ragged and still weeping fluid. Infection had already set in. His skin burned beneath her touch, despite the hours in freezing temperatures. "You should have died out there," she murmured, not unkindly as she heated water. "Would have been simpler for us both." Sarah had tended wounds before, gashes from logging accidents, burns, broken bones. John had once caught his arm in a piece of farm equipment, tearing muscle from bone. She'd stitched him up while he bit down on a leather strap, tears streaming into his beard. But this was different. This man was a stranger, an enemy according to everyone in Whitetail Valley. And he was dying despite her intervention. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. She packed it with yarrow and comfrey poultice, bandaged it tight with strips of boiled cloth. She spooned water between his cracked lips, most of which dribbled down his chin. His breathing remained shallow and rapid, his pulse thready beneath her fingertips. When she had done all she could, Sarah collapsed into the rocking chair beside the fireplace, one hand still clutching the bloodied rag she'd used to clean his wound. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, as if nature itself protested her decision. She glanced at the rifle mounted above the door, then back at the man laid out before her hearth. One bullet would erase her mistake. No one would know. The storm would delay any visitors for days, and by then she could have buried him in the deepening drifts. But Sarah knew she would know, and the knowing would haunt her like John's ghost never had. She dozed fitfully in the chair that night, waking at every moan or shift from her patient. By morning, his fever had worsened. His skin gleamed with sweat, his breathing labored. He muttered in his native tongue, words that sounded to Sarah like prayers or perhaps curses. She changed his bandages, forced more water down his throat, and added willow bark to her treatments, hoping to break the fever before it cooked his brain beyond saving. The second day brought no improvement. Sarah went about her chores, feeding the animals, clearing more snow, chopping wood, with half her attention always on the cabin. She found herself rushing through tasks, hurrying back to check on him as if her presence might somehow tether him to life. It was foolishness. She barely knew why she was fighting so hard for a stranger who had asked for death. On the third day, as weak winter sunlight filtered through the oiled paper windows, something shifted. The Apache's breathing eased. His skin, when she touched his forehead, felt merely warm rather than scorching. Sarah allowed herself a small measure of hope, not that he would survive necessarily, but that if he died now, it would be with dignity, not writhing in fever dreams on a stranger's floor. By nightfall, he opened his eyes. Clear this time, alert and watchful. They tracked her movements as she prepared a thin broth, assessing without judgment. He made no attempt to speak, and Sarah found herself equally silent. What was there to say? Words seemed inadequate for the strangeness of their situation. Finally, as she knelt beside him with a wooden bowl, he spoke. "Why?" The single word emerged rough from disuse and pain. Sarah considered the question, testing several answers in her mind before settling on honesty. I don't know. He studied her face with unsettling intensity. Your people kill mine. Not me, she replied, helping him lift his head slightly to sip the broth. I haven't killed anyone. Your husband? His gaze flickered to the men's boots by the door, the coat hanging from a peg, the larger gloves beside her smaller ones. Dead, Sarah said shortly. 3 winters now. Fever took him. Something passed across the Apache's face then. Not quite. Understanding, but recognition of a shared experience. My wife also. Soldiers came, blue coats. The simple statement hung in the air between them, not an accusation exactly, but a truth that couldn't be unheard. This man had lost someone too, violently at the hands of those who looked like her. She could have offered platitudes or apologies, but neither seemed right. Instead, she asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to grant her this knowledge. "Kiantu," he finally said. "It means mountain lion in your tongue." Sarah nodded, accepting the gift of this small truth. "I'm Sarah Blackwood." "I will remember," he said. "When I thank your spirit after you kill me." The words sent a jolt through her. "I'm not going to kill you." Kiantu's expression didn't change. "Others will come. They will kill me, kill you for helping." "No one's coming in this weather," she countered, though she knew spring would eventually arrive, bringing with it riders from town checking on outlying homesteads. "And you'll be gone by then." "Gone where?" he asked simply. Sarah had no answer. She busied herself with stoking the fire, aware of his eyes following her. The question lingered between them, unanswerable yet demanding acknowledgement. Where could he go? The Apache lands were far to the south now, and traveling alone, wounded through winter mountains, was certain death. The nearest town would hang him on sight. Army patrols would shoot him. She had saved him from a quick death in the snow only, to deliver him to an uncertain fate that might prove worse. Days passed in a strange, suspended state. The storm raged, then subsided, then built again, as if winter itself conspired to isolate them. Kiantu grew stronger by increments, first sitting up, then standing briefly with Sarah's support, then making his own way to the crude outhouse she'd built off the back porch. His wound healed slowly but cleanly, the angry red fading to pink. They developed a cautious rhythm, sharing the small space with careful courtesy. Sarah taught him to play checkers using buttons and coins on a board John had carved. Kiantu showed her how to weave thin strips of bark into small, tight baskets that could hold water. They spoke little, but the silence between them gradually transformed from wary to companionable. One evening, as snow fell in lazy spirals outside the window, Kiantu told her about his people, how they'd once ranged freely through mountains and valleys, following game and seasons, how the coming of settlers had pushed them into ever smaller territories, how disease had claimed his first child before she drew breath, how his wife had died defending their camp while he was away hunting. He spoke without bitterness, stating facts as plainly as one might describe the weather. In return, Sarah shared her own story, how she'd come west as a bride of 18, full of romantic notions about frontier life that quickly crumbled beneath the harsh realities, how she and John had worked the land until their hands bled, only to see crops fail and cattle die, how they'd eventually found a fragile balance only for illness to snatch it away in a matter of days, how she'd stayed because leaving seemed harder than enduring. "You are strong," Kiantu observed, his fingers tracing the scar that ran along his side. "Stronger than you know." "I'm stubborn," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." A smile ghosted across his lips. "My people say stubborn tree bends less in storm." By early December, Kiantu could move freely about the cabin. He insisted on helping with chores, chopping kindling into precise stacks, repairing a leak in the roof that had plagued Sarah for months, teaching her more efficient ways to snare rabbits in winter. His presence filled a void she hadn't acknowledged. Not the specific absence of John, but the broader emptiness of living without human connection. Yet beneath their growing ease lay the constant knowledge of discovery. Every distant sound made them both tense. When a branch scraped against the window, one night, Keantu reached instinctively for the knife he kept tucked in his belt. Sarah found herself listening more keenly when she ventured outside, eyes scanning the tree line for signs of approach. The inevitable happened 2 days before Christmas. Sarah was feeding the chickens when she heard it. The unmistakable jingle of harness bells approaching along the seldom-used road. Her stomach dropped as she counted 3 riders appearing between the snow-laden pines. She recognized them immediately. Sheriff Lancaster led the group, his grey mustache crusted with ice, rifle balanced casually across his saddle. Behind him rode Edward Simmons, who owned the general store and half the buildings in town, and young Billy Harper, whose family's ranch bordered her land to the east. None were men she would have chosen to find an Apache warrior in her home. Sarah set down the feed bucket with deliberate calm and walked to meet them at the edge of her yard. Her mind raced. Keantu was inside. Perhaps if she kept them outdoors, made some excuse. "Morning, gentlemen," she called, forcing brightness into her voice. "Unusual to see visitors this time of year." Lancaster dismounted stiffly, his breath clouding around his weathered face. "Checking on outlying folks after that big blow. Some cabins up north got completely buried. Dawson's lost their barn roof." "That's thoughtful," Sarah said, not moving from her position. "I'm managing fine, as you can see." Edward Simmons remained on his horse, looking down at her with the faintly condescending expression he reserved for women and children. "We brought some supplies from town. Christmas charity for widows and such." He gestured to the burlap sacks, tied to his saddle. The implied pity stung, but Sarah smiled tightly. "That's kind but unnecessary. I'm well stocked for winter." "Least you could do is offer coffee to men who rode all this way," Billy Harper said, dismounting with the confidence of youth. "Damn cold out here." Without waiting for permission, he started toward the cabin. Sarah stepped into his path. "I was just heading out to check my trap lines. Perhaps another time." Lancaster's eyes narrowed slightly. Sarah had never been especially social, but outright inhospitality was unlike her. "Something wrong, Mrs. Blackwood?" "Not at all, just busy." She gestured vaguely toward the trees. "Daylight's precious this time of year. Won't take but a minute to warm up," Billy insisted, already moving around her. "My toes are about froze solid." Sarah's mouth went dry as the young man strode toward her door. There was nothing she could do to stop him without raising more suspicion. She followed quickly, heart hammering against her ribs, hoping against reason that Keantu had somehow heard the approach and hidden himself. Billy pushed open the door without knocking. "Damn, but it's good to get out of that wind." His words cut off abruptly as he stepped inside, his body suddenly rigid in the doorway. Sarah knew what he saw. Keantu stood by the fire, tall and unmistakable, wearing John's old shirt, but still undeniably Apache from his braided hair to his moccasined feet. He held no weapon, but his stance was alert, coiled like a spring. "Jesus Christ," Billy breathed, reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Don't," Sarah said sharply, pushing past him into the cabin. She positioned herself between the two men. "He's injured. He's no threat." Lancaster appeared in the doorway behind Billy, his hand already on his gun. His weathered face hardened as he took in the scene. "Step aside, Mrs. Blackwood." "I will not," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This man has been under my care. He was wounded and half dead when I found him during the storm." Edward Simmons crowded in behind. The sheriff, his florid face darkening at the sight of Keantu. That's an Apache brave in your house, woman. Have you lost your mind? I've lost nothing except perhaps my patience, Sarah retorted. He needed help, and I gave it. That's all. That's all, Lancaster repeated incredulously. You're harboring an enemy combatant. The army's been hunting their band for months after they raided the Thompson place down south. 2 settlers dead. Sarah glanced at Keantu, whose expression remained impassive, though she sensed the tension radiating from him like heat. He was alone and wounded when I found him. Whatever happened elsewhere, he's been here, under my roof, harming no one. Billy Harper spat on her clean-swept floor. Indians are Indians. This one would have slit your throat as soon as he could stand. He's been able to stand for weeks, Sarah said coldly. As you can see, my throat remains uncut. The men exchanged glances, confusion momentarily tempering their hostility. Lancaster cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you're a God-fearing woman who believes in Christian charity. But this goes beyond helping a stranger. This man's people have killed white folks. That makes him dangerous. And how many of his people have white folks killed? Sarah asked quietly. The cabin fell silent, except for the popping of the fire. Edward Simmons' face flushed deeper. That's different, is it? Sarah held her ground, though her knees felt weak. I'm not asking you to understand my decision. I'm telling you that this man is under my protection in my home. Lancaster's hand hadn't moved from his gun. Law doesn't work that way, ma'am. I've got a duty to apprehend enemies of the settlement. The settlement? Sarah's laugh held no humor. You mean the town that checks on me once a winter out of obligation? The neighbors who offered thoughts and prayers when John died but couldn't? Spare a day's labor to help with harvest? That settlement? Behind her, Keantu spoke for the first time, his voice low and measured. I will go. No need for blood here. Sarah turned to him sharply. No. Yes, he said simply. They will not leave without me. They'll kill you, she whispered. Keantu's dark eyes held hers. Maybe, maybe not. He looked past her to the 3 men. I surrender freely. No harm to the woman. Lancaster considered this, then nodded curtly. Bind his hands, Billy. As the young man moved forward with a length of rope, Sarah felt desperation rise like bile in her throat. Wait, she said, mind racing. There must be another way. Edward, Simmons snorted. What did you plan to do? Keep him as a pet, hidden away all winter until the spring thaw? His scornful words sparked something in Sarah. Not a plan exactly, but a possibility. She straightened her spine and looked directly at Lancaster. No, I plan to marry him. The cabin erupted in shocked exclamations. Billy Harper actually took a step backward, as if her words carried physical force. Lancaster stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. Have you gone completely mad? Simmons sputtered. Marry an Indian? It's unnatural, immoral, is it? Sarah challenged, gaining confidence as the desperate idea took shape. Is it more immoral than murder? Than executing a man who's done no harm to any of us? The law, Lancaster began. The law recognizes marriage, Sarah interrupted. And the law in this territory says a man becomes a citizen when he marries a citizen. Isn't that right, Sheriff? Lancaster frowned, thrown off balance by her unexpected tactic. Well, yes, there are provisions for foreigners who marry into the community, but then it's settled, Sarah said with a finality she didn't entirely feel. If you're so concerned about legality, we'll make it legal. You can perform the ceremony. Yourself, Sheriff, right now. The men exchanged bewildered glances. Keantu remained still, his expression unreadable to the others, though Sarah caught the brief flash of surprise in his eyes. This is insanity, Simmons muttered. She's clearly been out here alone too long. But Lancaster was considering his lawman's mind, working through the implications. It would solve the immediate problem, he said slowly. Make him her legal responsibility. No need for bloodshed or a trial. You can't seriously be entertaining this madness, Simmons protested. Billy Harper, who had been silent, suddenly laughed. "Hell, let her do it. She wants to tie herself to a savage, that's her funeral. Better than having to drag him back to town in this cold." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she trembled at the path unfolding before her. She hadn't planned this, hadn't considered what it would mean beyond the immediate salvation of Chiantu's life. Yet she found herself saying, "Well, Sheriff, will you do your duty and perform a legal marriage, or will you murder an unarmed man in cold blood in a Christian woman's home?" Lancaster's weathered face worked through several emotions before settling into grim resignation. "I don't like it, but it avoids complications." He fixed Sarah with a hard stare. "You understand what you're doing. There's no undoing this. Town won't look kindly on it." "I'm aware," Sarah said simply. "And you?" Lancaster turned to Chiantu. "You willing to be bound by white man's law? Take this woman as wife?" Chiantu's gaze found Sarah's, a question in his eyes that she couldn't fully interpret. After a long moment, he nodded once. "I accept." And so, with grudging officiality, Sheriff Lancaster performed the strangest wedding Whitetail Valley had ever witnessed. No vows of love were spoken, no rings exchanged, no celebrations followed. Just terse, legal phrases that bound together two people who, weeks earlier, had been strangers and enemies by the reckoning of their worlds. When it was done, Lancaster closed his small legal book with a snap. "I'll file the paper in town. But hear me, both of you, this arrangement doesn't erase what you are." He looked pointedly at Chiantu. "Step out of line once. Give anyone reason to think you're a threat, and marriage won't save you." After the men left, the cabin fell into heavy silence. Sarah stood by the window, watching until the riders disappeared into the trees. Her hands shook now that the immediate danger had passed. Behind her, Chiantu remained motionless by the fire. "Why?" he asked, finally, echoing the first word he had spoken to her weeks earlier. Sarah turned to face the man, who was now, by law if nothing else, her husband. "I don't know," she admitted. "It seemed the only way." Chiantu studied her with those fathomless dark eyes. "You have bound yourself to me. Your people will turn from you now." "They were never really my people," Sarah said softly, the truth of it settling in her bones. "Not after John died. Maybe not even before." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. The world beyond the cabin windows blurred into white oblivion. Inside, two people from different worlds stood regarding each other across a chasm suddenly bridged by a desperate act neither had foreseen. For better or worse, their fates were now entwined by more than chance. What that would mean in the days ahead, neither could say. But as the fire crackled between them, Sarah felt something unexpected stir within her chest. Not regret, not fear, but a curious sense of possibility in the face of an uncertain future. January settled over Whitetail Valley like a heavy blanket, muffling the world in white stillness. Inside Sarah's cabin, now legally shared with Chiantu, a new routine emerged, fragile as frost patterns on glass. They moved around each other with careful consideration, neither fully comfortable with the arrangement thrust upon them, yet both accepting its necessity. The wedding ceremony, if it could be called that, had changed everything and nothing. They still performed the same daily tasks. They still spoke little, yet an invisible boundary had been crossed. A line redrawn around them that now excluded the outside world more definitively than before. Their first concession to their new status was practical. Sarah moved her sewing basket and personal items to one side of the cabin, creating a clear delineation of space. Chiantu took the opposite side, near the back door, where he slept on a pallet of furs and blankets. He never approached her sleeping area, and she respected his boundaries with equal diligence. The center of the cabin, the table, the hearth, the rocking chair, became shared territory, neutral ground where they coexisted during waking hours. Sarah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The precise way he sharpened her kitchen knives, the silent concentration with which he repaired a broken chair leg, the careful motions as he braided his long black hair each morning. He was a man of rituals, she realized. Like her, he found stability in the repetition of necessary tasks. One bitter afternoon, as wind howled in the eaves, Chiantu sat cross-legged by the hearth, hands busy with a pile of twigs and sinew. Sarah paused in her mending, curious despite herself. "What are you making?" she asked. He glanced up, seemingly surprised by her interest. "Snare, different from yours. Better for deep snow." Sarah set aside her sewing and moved closer, drawn by practical interest. "Show me." He hesitated only briefly before spreading the materials on the floor between them. With economical movements, he demonstrated how the twigs formed a collapsible structure, how the sinew loop was positioned to catch a rabbit's hind leg rather than its neck. "In deep snow, animals hop higher," he explained, his English improving daily. "Regular snare too low." Sarah watched his hands, strong, capable hands, with calluses that spoke of a lifetime of survival skills. "My husband always set spring traps, but they freeze up in this weather." Chiantu nodded. "Metal betrays the cold. Wood and sinew bend, adapt." There was wisdom in that, Sarah thought, a philosophy as much as a practical observation. She wondered how many generations of knowledge flowed through his hands, how many centuries of adaptation and innovation had refined these techniques. "I could set these tomorrow," she offered. "We're running low on meat." "We will set them," Chiantu corrected. Quietly, "I will go with you." It was the first time he had proposed leaving the safety of the cabin since the wedding. Sarah considered the implications. What if someone from town saw them together? But necessity outweighed caution. Their food stores were dwindling faster than anticipated, with 2 mouths to feed. "All right," she agreed. At first light, they ventured out before dawn, frost crackling beneath their boots. The forest stood silent around them, trees shrouded in white, branches drooping under snow's weight. Their breath clouded in the frigid air as they waded through knee-deep drifts, following game trails barely visible to Sarah's eye, but clear as signposts to Chiantu. He moved differently in the woods, more fluid, more certain. The slight limp from his healing wound disappeared as he slipped between trees with the ease of someone returning to his natural element. Sarah struggled to keep pace, unaccustomed to the quick, light steps he employed to stay atop crusty snow rather than breaking through. "Like this," he said, noticing her difficulty. He demonstrated the technique again, weight on the balls of the feet, steps quick and light. Sarah tried to mimic him, failing at first, then gradually finding the rhythm. When she successfully crossed a patch of snow without sinking, surprise and delight broke across her face. Chiantu's eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. They set 12 snares along a winding route, Chiantu selecting each location with careful consideration, near brush piles, along narrow passages between fallen logs, under low-hanging branches where rabbits might seek shelter. As they worked, he taught her to read the subtle signs of animal presence, the faint depressions where grouse had burrowed into snow for warmth, the gnawed bark showing where deer had passed recently, the nearly invisible tracks of foxes hunting. "Smaller prey. You see tracks. I see stories," he explained, crouching to point out a complex intersection of prints. "Fox chased squirrel here. Squirrel escaped to tree. Fox waited, then gave up. All this happened before sunrise today." Sarah marveled at how much information he extracted from what looked to her like mere disturbances in the snow. She'd lived in these mountains for years, yet never truly seen them through such knowing eyes. The day brightened around them. Sunlight, striking through bare branches to create diamond patterns on the snow. For the first time since he'd arrived at her cabin, Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease. Out here, away from the fraught complexities of their arrangement, they were simply two people navigating a winter landscape, sharing knowledge that predated any conflict between their peoples. When they returned to check the snares the following day, 5 had been sprung, yielding 4 rabbits and a grouse. Kiantu showed her how to field-dress the animals efficiently, conserving every usable part, not just meat, but sinew for binding, bones for tools, fur for insulation. My grandmother believed wasting an animal's gift was the greatest disrespect, he said, as his knife worked with practiced precision. She said, hungry winters come to those who take without gratitude. Sarah thought about how John had hunted, taking only the choicest cuts, discarding the rest. How she herself had never considered using rabbit skulls as scoops or binding broken tools with animal sinew. There was intelligence in this economy, born not of greed, but its opposite, a deep understanding of scarcity and respect. Their days fell into a pattern: morning chores, tending animals, checking snares; afternoons spent preserving food, repairing equipment, preparing for the next day; evenings around the fire, the space between them gradually shrinking as winter deepened and practical matters drew them into reluctant collaboration. Kiantu began telling stories in the firelight, legends of his people, tales of cleverness and caution. Sarah found herself looking forward to these narratives. The way his voice dropped lower took on a rhythm that suggested generations of oral tradition. He spoke of coyotes' mischief, of how the mountains were formed from the bodies of sleeping giants, of how the first Apache learned fire from watching lightning strike dead trees. In return, she shared books with him, her small collection of novels and practical guides that had been her companions through lonely winters. Kiantu's reading was limited but improving. He followed her finger across lines of type, sounding out difficult words, his quick mind absorbing new vocabulary rapidly. One night, as snow pelted the windows and wind moaned through cracks in the walls, Sarah read aloud from Robinson Crusoe. Kiantu listened intently, drawn into the story of a man stranded far from home. "This man, Crusoe," he said when she paused to stoke the fire. "He sees his island as a prison." Sarah nodded. "He's desperate to escape, to return to England. But the island gives him everything he needs." Kiantu gestured to the small cabin around them. "Food, shelter, safety. Still, he wants a different place." Sarah considered this perspective, so unlike the European quest for conquest that drove the novel. "I suppose we're taught to always want more, to see success as accumulation and expansion. My people measured wealth differently," Kiantu said. "Not by what you possess, but by what you can afford to share." The words lingered in Sarah's mind long after she'd closed the book. She thought of Whitetail Junction with its stark divisions, between those who owned businesses and land and those who worked for them. How even in their small community, status was determined by accumulation. How she'd never quite fit that mold, even before John's death. By February, their routine had grown comfortable. They no longer stiffened when accidentally brushing past each other in the narrow spaces of the cabin. They worked together on small projects, repairing the chicken coop, preserving meat, reinforcing the barn roof against heavy snow. Sarah found herself speaking more freely, asking questions about his life before, sharing her own memories without the weight of grief that had colored them for so long. She learned that Kiantu had been a scout for his tribe, known for moving silently through terrain others found impassable, that he'd had a daughter who died young, a brother who'd gone south with another band, a talent for finding water in dry places. He didn't speak of how he'd come to be wounded and alone in the forest near her cabin, and Sarah didn't ask. Some stories, she understood, belonged to their owners alone. In turn, she told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, daughter of a doctor who taught her to read medical texts alongside fairy tales. about meeting John at a harvest dance, marrying at 18, journeying west with dreams that had weathered gradually into compromises. About the stillborn child she'd delivered alone while John was away trading, how she'd buried the tiny body under an aspen tree without ever showing him the face of their son. "The grief stays," Chiantu said when she finished this last story, not as a question but as a recognition. "Changes shape, but stays." "Yes," Sarah whispered, surprised by how the simple acknowledgement loosened something long knotted inside her chest. "It does." The first thaw came in early March, not the true spring but a false promise. A few days of melting eaves and mud before winter would inevitably return for its final stand. Sarah and Chiantu took advantage of the milder weather to check more distant trap lines and replenish their dwindling firewood supply. They were returning from one such expedition, arms laden with wood, when they spotted the riders. 3 men approaching along the road from town, still distant but unmistakable. Sarah's heart lurched against her ribs. "Inside," she said urgently. "Quickly." They stashed the wood and slipped through the back door moments before the riders entered. The clearing. Through the window, Sarah recognized Sheriff Lancaster, Reverend Schultz, and Caleb Foster, who owned the sawmill. Not a social call, then. "Stay calm," she murmured to Chiantu as she smoothed her hair and straightened her apron. "Let me speak first." He nodded once, positioning himself near the hearth, present but not confrontational. Sarah drew a steadying breath and opened the door before they could knock. "Gentlemen," she said with forced pleasantness, "twice in one winter, I'm becoming positively social." Lancaster dismounted, his face graver than usual. "Mrs. Blackwood, or whatever you're calling. Yourself now. May we come in?" The pointed barb wasn't lost on Sarah, but she held the door wider. "Of course." The men entered with obvious reluctance, eyes immediately finding Chiantu. Reverend Schultz made a small noise of disapproval, while Caleb Foster kept his hand near his belt, where Sarah knew he carried a pistol. "We've come on serious business," Lancaster said without preamble. "There's been trouble south of here. The stage was attacked 3 days ago. Driver killed, passengers robbed." Sarah's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry to hear that. What does it have to do with us?" "Witnesses described Indians," Caleb Foster said flatly. "Apache, most likely." Chiantu's expression didn't change, but Sarah felt the sudden tension emanating from him. "And you immediately thought of my husband," she said, purposely using the word to remind them of the legal protection it afforded. "Can you account for his whereabouts 3 days ago?" Lancaster asked. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "He was here, Sheriff, as he has been every day since you performed our wedding. We've barely left the property with all this snow." "Convenient," Foster muttered. "It's the truth," Sarah said firmly. "We've been trapping, cutting wood, surviving winter like everyone else." Reverend Schultz spoke for the first time, his reedy voice carrying the weight of moral certainty. "Mrs. Blackwood, the congregation is concerned for your soul. This arrangement goes against God's natural order. We've come to offer you sanctuary in town, away from this situation." Sarah stared at him incredulously. "You're suggesting I abandon my home, my husband?" "We're suggesting you come to your senses," Foster cut in. "Whatever madness possessed you to align yourself with an Indian, it's not too late to rectify it." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "There was no madness involved, Mr. Foster. Just humanity, something seemingly in short supply in Whitetail Junction these days." Lancaster held up a placating hand. "No need for insults. We're here out of concern." "Are you?" Sarah challenged. "Or are you here because you've already decided Chiantu must be responsible for any trouble involving Indians, regardless of evidence?" The sheriff's weathered face hardened. "Evidence is thin on the ground out here, ma'am, but I know what I know. Apache warriors don't change their nature just because some misguided woman takes pity on them." Chiantu finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly, I have not left this land since coming here. I have not harmed any white man since before the snow fell. And we're supposed to take the word of a savage? Foster scoffed. Sarah moved to stand beside Keantu, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You're taking the word of two witnesses, mine and his. Unless you have actual evidence connecting him to this attack, I suggest you look elsewhere for your culprits. The three men exchanged glances, a silent communication that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. There was something they weren't saying, some greater purpose to this visit beyond accusation. Reverend Schultz cleared his throat. There's another matter, Mrs. Blackwood. The town council met yesterday. There's concern about precedent. Your situation creates complications that extend beyond personal choice. What my colleague means, Lancaster said bluntly, is that we can't have white women marrying Indians whenever it suits them. Creates all manner of legal and social problems. I wasn't aware my marriage required town approval, Sarah said coldly. It doesn't, Lancaster conceded. But your continued residence in this community might. People are talking about boycotting your trade at the market. Some have suggested more direct measures to express their disapproval. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt Keantu shift beside her, a barely perceptible movement closer to the rifle mounted above the door. Are you threatening us, Sheriff? She asked quietly. Lancaster looked uncomfortable. Not threatening. Warning. I can't control what every hothead might do, especially after this latest attack. There's anger brewing in town. So you're suggesting we leave? Abandon my property, my animals, everything I've built here? It might be safest, the sheriff said, not meeting her eyes. At least until tempers cool. Sarah looked around the cabin at the walls she'd chinked with her own hands, the shelves John had built, the bed where she'd nursed Keantu back from death's edge. This was her home, purchased with years of labor and sweat. The thought of surrendering it to fear and prejudice burned like acid in her throat. No, she said finally. This is my land, legally deeded. My husband is legally married to me by your own hand, Sheriff. We have broken no laws. We will not be driven from our home by rumors and unfounded accusations. Foster's face darkened. You're making a mistake, woman. Perhaps, Sarah acknowledged. But it's my mistake to make. The men left with obvious reluctance, trailing warnings, and disapproval in their wake. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared down the snowy track, her heart pounding in her ears. Behind her, Keantu remained motionless by the hearth. When she finally closed the door and turned to him, his expression was unreadable, dark eyes reflecting firelight. They will come back, he said simply. Not with words next time. Sarah leaned heavily against the rough-hewn door. I know. We could leave, he suggested, voice neutral. Go north, perhaps, or west. And surrender everything I've worked for? Sarah shook her head. I won't be driven off my own land by fear and ignorance. Keantu studied her with an intensity that made her skin warm. You would stay and fight for this place? Wouldn't you? She countered. For your home. Something shifted in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or respect. My people fought. We lost. Sometimes survival means knowing when to move like water around. A stone. Sarah crossed to the fire, warming her suddenly cold hands. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Keantu. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. Our arrangement served its purpose. You're healed now. Our arrangement, he repeated, testing the words. Is that how you see our marriage? An arrangement? The question caught her off guard. They had never discussed the nature of their relationship, had carefully avoided acknowledging the legal bond that existed solely to preserve his life. To hear him mention it directly made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't anticipated. Isn't that what it is? She asked carefully. A solution to an immediate problem. Chiantu moved closer, stopping within arm's reach, perhaps at first, but now Sarah found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. "I don't know what it is now," she admitted softly. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled. Wind whispered at the windows. Outside, the false spring was already surrendering to winter's return, fat snowflakes beginning to spiral from leaden skies. "I will not leave you to face them alone," Chiantu said finally. "Whatever comes." It wasn't a declaration of love or even affection. It was simpler and somehow more profound, a promise born of shared experience, of mutual respect, hard-won through winter's crucible. Sarah felt its weight settle around her like a mantle, both burden and protection. "Then we face it together," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever comes." As darkness fell, they moved about the cabin with new awareness of each other, their silence now charged with unspoken possibilities. The boundaries they had carefully maintained seemed suddenly arbitrary, lines drawn in snow already melting. Sarah felt something shifting between them, invisible but undeniable, like spring stirring beneath frozen ground, patient but inevitable. That night, for the first time, Chiantu did not retreat to his separate sleeping area when darkness fell. Instead, he remained by the fire, crafting arrows with meticulous attention, glancing occasionally at Sarah as she prepared herbs for drying. Neither mentioned the visitors or their warnings. Neither spoke of what might come with morning light. But, in the space between words, in the quiet rhythm of shared work, something new took root, an understanding deeper than language could express. Two lives from different worlds, entwined by circumstance, now choosing to remain bound by something that had no name but felt increasingly like home. March arrived with temperamental fury, bringing days of blinding sunshine, followed by sudden squalls that dropped 6 inches of snow in hours. The pattern matched Sarah's state of mind. Moments of unexpected clarity interspersed with swirling confusion. Since the confrontation with Lancaster and the others, something fundamental had shifted between her and Chiantu, though neither had put it into words. Their daily routines continued, but the careful distance they'd maintained had dissolved. When they worked side by side now, their hands occasionally brushed without either pulling away. At night, they sat closer to the fire, shoulders sometimes touching as they mended clothing or fashioned tools. Small changes, perhaps invisible to anyone else, but to Sarah they felt monumental. One evening, as they shared the last of the dried apple preserves, Chiantu reached across the table and gently touched a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. Tucking it behind her ear with unexpected tenderness, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Your hair," he said softly, "like sunset on copper." It was the first compliment he'd ever paid her, and the unexpectedness of it made her cheeks warm. "My mother always called it unfortunate," she replied, attempting lightness. "Too wild to be fashionable." "Why tame what is beautiful as itself?" he asked simply. Sarah didn't answer, couldn't find words adequate to respond. Instead, she busied herself with clearing their bowls, aware of his eyes following her movements across the small space of their shared home. When had she begun thinking of it as theirs, rather than hers? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, only that it had happened without conscious decision. For Chiantu's part, he had begun to share more openly, speaking of his life before, as a respected warrior in his band, as a husband whose wife had died defending their village from soldiers, as a man cut adrift from the traditions and connections that had defined him. He told her about Apache customs, about the ceremonial coming-of-age rituals for young men and women, about how marriages were celebrated with days of feasting and dancing. "In my people's way," he explained one night, "marriage is not just between Man and woman, it is between families, between spirits, everyone has a role in supporting the new bond. Sarah thought about their own wedding, hasty, cold, performed under duress with no celebration or blessing. "I'm sorry you were forced into this mockery of marriage," she said quietly. "It must seem a poor substitute for your traditions." Chiantu was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Not all bonds need ceremony to be real," he finally said. "Some grow like trees, slow, strong from small seeds." The words hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging their full implication. But that night, when Sarah retired to her bed, she left the partition she'd erected partially open. An invitation, perhaps, though to what exactly she wasn't certain. March gave way to April with quickening thaws. Creek ice broke with thunderous cracks. Snow retreated up mountainsides. The first green shoots pushed through sodden earth in protected hollows. Sarah and Chiantu spent more time outdoors, repairing winter damage to outbuildings, preparing soil for planting, checking traps set higher in the foothills where game was more plentiful in the leaner seasons. On a particularly mild afternoon, they hiked to a ridge overlooking the valley. Spring's early bloom had transformed the landscape. Patches of wildflowers dotted meadows, still partially snow-covered. Aspens showed the first hint of pale green. Buds and birds called enthusiastically from every direction. They sat side by side on a sun-warmed boulder, sharing dried venison and the last of winter's preserves. "When I first came west," Sarah mused, gazing across the sprawling vista, "I thought the mountains would crush me with their size. Everything seemed so vast, so uncaring of human presence." Chiantu nodded. "Mountains teach humility. They were here long before people, will remain long after." "Does that smallness bother you, knowing we're just temporary?" He considered this. "No. Temporary things can still matter. Sunset lasts only minutes, but changes how you see the world." Sarah glanced at him, struck by the simple wisdom in his words. She'd spent years feeling insignificant against the backdrop of wilderness, fighting to carve out a space that mattered. Yet Chiantu seemed at peace with transience, finding value in the fleeting rather than struggling against it. "Your people," she began carefully, "do you think they're still looking for you?" The question had been forming for weeks, but felt dangerous to ask. Would he leave if he knew where to find his band? Would he choose his people over this strange, fragile existence they'd built together? Chiantu's expression grew distant. "My band moved south before winter, following old migration paths toward warmer lands. By now they believe I joined my ancestors." "And would you go back, if you could find them?" He turned to face her directly, dark eyes searching hers. "Once," answer, would be yes without thought now. He paused, struggling with words. Now the path is less clear. Sarah felt something unfurl in her chest, not quite hope, but its quieter cousin. She didn't press him further. Instead, she reached for his hand, resting her fingers lightly over his. He turned his palm upward, entwining their fingers with deliberate care. They sat that way as afternoon light gilded the valley, connected by touch that acknowledged what words had not yet framed. Around them, spring continued its relentless rebirth, indifferent to human complexities, yet somehow offering possibility with each new leaf and bud. The tranquility of that moment shattered 3 days later. Sarah was in the garden, turning soil for planting when hoofbeats pounded into the yard. She straightened, pushing hair from her face, to find Edward Simmons dismounting with unusual haste. His normally florid face was grey with tension. "Where is he?" Simmons demanded without greeting. "Good. Day to you too, Mr. Simmons," Sarah replied coolly, leaning on her spade. "My husband is checking trap lines. When will he return?" Something in his tone made Sarah's skin prickle with alarm. "What's happened?" Simmons glanced toward the tree line nervously. "Peter's family was attacked yesterday. Farm about 12 miles. South. House burned. Livestock slaughtered. Sarah's chest tightened. The family, wife and youngest, made it to town. Husband and oldest boy didn't. Simmons' voice hardened. Witnesses say it was Apache, a small band moving fast. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly. And naturally you've come to accuse my husband, who has been here continuously for months. Lancaster sent me to warn you, Simmons said, surprising her. There's a group forming in town, young men mostly, angry, armed. They're talking about settling the Indian problem once and for all. Cold dread pooled in Sarah's stomach. And the sheriff is allowing this? Simmons shifted uncomfortably. He's riding to the army outpost for reinforcements. But it'll take time, and these boys aren't in a waiting mood. They've been drinking since the news came in. So you came to warn us. Sarah studied his face, searching for the catch. Why? The storekeeper looked away. I don't hold with lynching. Proper trial or nothing. That's civilization. He glanced back at her. But I can't stop what's coming. Best get your husband and clear out. At least until Lancaster returns with soldiers. Before Sarah could respond, Chiantu emerged from the tree line, carrying 3 snow hares strung on a line. He stopped short at the sight of Simmons' horse, then approached cautiously, eyes alert to the tension evident in their postures. Mr. Simmons brings news, Sarah said, carefully as he reached them. There's been an attack south of here. Apache raiders. Chiantu's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw the almost imperceptible straightening of his spine, the slight shift of weight to the balls of his feet, a hunter's stance, ready for sudden movement. And now a mob forms, he said, not a question. Simmons nodded curtly. You've got maybe 2 hours before they arrive. I'd be elsewhere when they do. After the storekeeper departed in a cloud of dust, Sarah and Chiantu stood in heavy silence. The spring breeze carried the scent of warming earth and new growth, cruelly at odds with the dread settling between them. We should pack, Sarah said. Finally. Take what we can carry. Chiantu shook his head slowly. They will follow. Track us. We can't stay here and face them. There must be 20 men in town who'd join such a mob, all armed, all filled with fear and whiskey courage. Exactly, Chiantu said quietly. Fear makes men dangerous. Running shows fear. Sarah stared at him incredulously. So we should just wait for them to arrive, let them drag you away, or worse. Chiantu placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. There is a third path. Inside the cabin he moved with swift purpose, gathering specific items, rope, his knife, small pouches of dried herbs, and a water skin. Sarah watched in confusion until understanding dawned. You're leaving, she said, voice hollow. Alone. Not leaving, he corrected. Creating a false trail. If I make signs that the Apache band passed near here, heading north, they will follow that trail instead. And when they catch up and find it was just you, Sarah's voice rose, they'll kill you without hesitation. I won't be caught, Chiantu said with quiet confidence. I can move faster alone, leave misleading signs, double back before dawn. Sarah shook her head vehemently. It's too dangerous. We should both go west perhaps, toward the high country where they won't follow. Chiantu stepped closer, taking her, vase between his hands with unexpected gentleness. Sarah, trust me in this. I was a scout for my people. I know how to move without being seen, how to lead pursuers in circles until they are exhausted, confused. The sound of her name on his lips, something he rarely used, preferring no address at all, stilled her protests momentarily. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I will return, he promised. 2 days, no more. And if you don't, she whispered, then you take horses, supplies, go to the trading post at North Fork. Man there, Peterson, owes me a favor. Owes you? Sarah blinked in surprise. When did you? Stayed with him before storm caught me, fixed his roof, hunted for his family when he was sick. Kiantu's mouth quirked slightly. Not all white men see only enemy when they look at me. Sarah absorbed this new information, evidence of a life he'd led before arriving unconscious at her door, connections she hadn't known existed. How much else didn't she know about this man who had somehow become essential to her world? 2 days, she repeated, making it a demand rather than a question. He nodded once, then surprised her by leaning forward to press his forehead against hers, an intimate gesture neither had attempted before. 2 days, he confirmed softly. Sarah helped him prepare, fighting the dread that threatened to overwhelm her practical nature. She packed pemmican and jerky, filled water skins, mended a tear in his buckskin shirt with swift, nervous stitches. All the while, the spring afternoon waned, shadows lengthening across the yard, marking the passage of precious time. As dusk approached, Kiantu stood at the edge of the clearing, dressed again in his original clothing rather than John's cast-offs, looking more like the warrior he had been than the man who had shared her home through winter. The transformation unsettled Sarah, a reminder of the vast differences in their backgrounds, the worlds that had shaped them into people who should, by all logic, remain enemies rather than whatever they had become to each other. "Remember," he said, checking the knife at his belt one final time, "if I don't return, don't wait. Go directly to Peterson's." Sarah nodded, throat too tight for words. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, she stepped forward and pressed, her lips to his, brief, urgent, a seal on an unspoken promise. When she pulled back, Kiantu's eyes had widened slightly, the only indication of surprise in his otherwise composed features. 2 days, she repeated, stepping back. Not a moment. Longer. He held her gaze for one heartbeat more, then turned and disappeared into the deepening shadows beneath the pines, moving with the silent grace of someone returning to his element. Sarah watched until the gathering darkness swallowed all trace of him, then slowly returned to the cabin, its emptiness suddenly stark after months of shared space. Night descended, bringing with it sounds that had never bothered her during her years of solitude, but now seemed ominous. Branches scraping against the roof, wind moaning through the chimney, distant coyotes conversing in yips and howls. Sarah moved restlessly through familiar routines, stoking the fire, feeding the animals, preparing a meal she had no appetite to eat. She found herself listening constantly for hoofbeats that would signal the mob's arrival. Hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. The night deepened. No riders came. By midnight, Sarah allowed herself to hope that Kiantu's diversion had worked, that the vengeful men from town had followed his false trail north, away from the cabin and its incriminating evidence of their arrangement. She dozed fitfully in, the rocking chair, rifle across her lap, starting awake at every creak and rustle. Dawn found her exhausted but alert, peering through windows for any sign of movement across the misty yard. The day stretched endlessly. Sarah forced herself to complete necessary chores, tending animals, hauling water, banking the fire, while her mind raced with possibilities, each more dire than the last. Had Kiantu been captured? Shot on sight? Had he perhaps seized the opportunity to escape, to rejoin his people, leaving her and their strange, unclassifiable relationship behind? She dismissed this last thought almost immediately. Whatever else she might not know about him, she knew his word was given with absolute intention. If he said he would return, he would, or die in the attempt. The first day passed without incident. No mob appeared at her door. No soldiers came asking questions. Sarah moved through her tasks like a ghost, present in body, but her thoughts constantly straying to the hills, where Kiantu might be leading pursuers on a frustrating chase. The second day dawned bright and clear. Spring birdsong filled the air with incongruous cheer. Sarah found herself counting hours, then minutes, growing more tense as the sun arced across the sky and began its descent toward the western peaks. By late afternoon, she had abandoned any pretense of normalcy, standing at the edge of the yard, straining for any sign of movement among the trees. When dusk fell with no sign of Chiantu, Sarah's resolve hardened. She began gathering supplies, food, clothing, ammunition, medical supplies, packing them efficiently into saddlebags. She would wait until full dark, then follow his instructions. North Fork Trading Post was a day's hard ride. She could reach it by tomorrow night if she pushed patience to her limits. The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light across the yard. Sarah was securing the last of her provisions when she heard it, a soft, deliberate rustle from the darkened tree line. She froze, hand dropping to the rifle slung across her back, too careful for an animal, too purposeful. "Who's there?" she called, voice steadier than she felt. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beneath the pines. Moonlight caught the gleam of dark hair, the outline of a familiar stance. "Chiantu?" Sarah whispered, scarcely daring to hope. He stepped fully into the clearing, and Sarah's heart lurched painfully in her chest. He was leaning heavily on a makeshift staff, face drawn with exhaustion or pain, clothing torn and smeared with dirt. But he was alive. He had returned. Sarah crossed the distance between them in seconds, reaching him just as his legs seemed ready to give way. She caught him around the waist, bearing some of his weight as they moved toward the cabin door. "You're hurt," she said, feeling dampness against her supporting arm. "Not badly," he replied, voice raspy with thirst. "Bullet grazed ribs. Clean. Wound." Inside, Sarah eased him onto a chair and quickly fetched water. He drank deeply, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as the worst of his thirst eased. In the lamplight, Sarah could see the damage more clearly, a bloody furrow along his left side, bruises darkening his jaw, hands raw from hard travel across rough terrain. "They followed you," she said, not a question. Chiantu nodded. 8 men. Angry, careless. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Led them in circles, 2 days chasing shadows. Sarah began cleaning his wounds with gentle efficiency, falling back on practical tasks to manage the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Did they give up? Some returned to town yesterday. Others continued north, still believing they chase war party. He winced slightly as she applied salve to the bullet graze. They will return eventually, but confused, divided in their certainty. And Lancaster, the army, saw patrol near Eastern Ridge, moving south, looking for raiders who attacked farm. Chiantu's eyes met hers gravely. "Real raiders, Sarah, not my imagination." The confirmation of actual Apache attackers in the region complicated everything. If a genuine war party was operating nearby, suspicion would naturally fall more heavily on Chiantu, regardless of evidence or alibis. "We need to leave," Sarah said, securing a bandage around his ribs. "As soon as you're strong enough to travel." "This changes everything." To her surprise, Chiantu shook his head. "No, leaving now confirms guilt in their eyes. We stay." "That's madness. They'll come back, and next time we meet them together," he interrupted. "Standing our ground, in your home, on your land." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand. His reasoning. Why risk it? We could start over somewhere else, somewhere people don't know our history. Chiantu reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers with surprising strength despite his exhaustion. "Running has cost my people everything, lands, traditions, children. I will not run again." "This isn't your fight," Sarah protested weakly. "It became my fight when I chose to stay," he replied, "when you chose to protect me, when we chose each other." The simple declaration silenced her arguments. In that moment, looking at his battered face lit by flickering lamplight, Sarah recognized the truth neither had fully acknowledged until now. Whatever had begun as necessity had transformed into choice, deliberate, mutual, irreversible. The legal ceremony Lancaster had performed months ago as a reluctant compromise had somehow become real in ways no one could have anticipated. "All right," she said finally. "We stay. We face whatever comes together." Chiantu's expression softened. With obvious effort, he raised his hand to her cheek, thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, as if memorizing its contours. "Together," he echoed. That night, for the first time, they shared the narrow bed, not in passion, but in quiet affirmation of their new understanding. Sarah lay curled against Chiantu's uninjured side, his arm around her shoulders, their breath gradually synchronizing. In the darkness outside, spring winds whispered through new leaves, carrying both promise and warning on their restless currents. The world would break in upon them again. Of that they had no illusions. But whatever came with morning light, they would face it not as unlikely allies bound by circumstance, but as partners who had chosen their shared path with open eyes and willing hearts. The weeks following Chiantu's return brought a cautious peace to the homestead. Spring unfurled fully across Whitetail Valley, painting the landscape in vivid greens and splashes of wildflower color. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Birds built nests in the eaves of the barn, and new life emerged everywhere Sarah looked. Lancaster returned from the army outpost with confirmation of what they already knew. A small band of Apache raiders had indeed attacked settlements to the south before. Disappearing into the mountains, soldiers patrolled the region, their blue uniforms occasionally visible on distant ridgelines. The immediate threat of mob justice receded as the townspeople's focus shifted to spring planting and repairing winter damage. "They'll be watching us, though," Sarah observed one evening as she and Chiantu planted the vegetable garden. Waiting for any excuse, Chiantu nodded, hands working the soil with practiced efficiency. Always safer to fear the stranger than understand him. "You're not a stranger anymore," Sarah said quietly. He glanced up, the hint of a smile warming his usually stoic features. "To you, no. To them, always." They worked side by side in the lengthening daylight, establishing new routines and rhythms. Chiantu taught Sarah to identify plants she had previously overlooked, herbs with medicinal properties, roots that could be ground into flour, shoots that tasted like honey when chewed. She showed him how to graft apple seedlings onto hardier rootstock, a skill her father had passed down from his New England childhood. Their conversations deepened, no longer constrained by caution or suspicion. At night, they shared the narrow bed without awkwardness, the initial strangeness giving way to comfortable familiarity. Chiantu's nightmares, which had frequently disturbed his sleep in earlier months, grew less frequent. Sarah found herself sleeping more soundly than she had in years, no longer startling awake at every nocturnal sound. Physical intimacy developed gradually between them, unrushed and natural. The first time Chiantu kissed her, truly kissed her. Not the desperate farewell she had initiated before his departure. It happened while they were washing dishes together. She'd laughed at something he said, a genuine laugh that surprised them both with its brightness, and he'd set down the plate. In his hands, turned to her, and cupped her face with gentle determination. "May I?" he asked, the formality in such stark contrast to their domestic setting that it made Sarah's heart flutter unexpectedly. She nodded, unable to find words. His lips met hers with careful tenderness at first, then with growing confidence, as she responded. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Sarah felt as though something long suspected had finally been confirmed, a truth they'd been circling for months. "I've wanted to do that," Chiantu admitted, "since you read Robinson Crusoe by firelight." Sarah laughed softly. "That long?" "Longer," he confessed. "But that was when I knew I could not leave this place. Could not leave you." The admission, so simply stated, filled Sarah with a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine streaming through the window. She touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple that she now knew came from a childhood fall from a horse. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered. From that point, their relationship evolved with the changing seasons. May brought heavy rains that kept them mostly indoors, experimenting with new intimacies and sharing stories from their pasts without the weight of secrets between them. Kiantu told her about his childhood as the son of a respected medicine man, about the years he'd spent learning to track and hunt, about the woman he'd loved and lost to the relentless encroachment of white settlers. "She was like summer storm," he said, describing his first wife. "Quick to anger, quick to laugh, hair black as crow wings, voice that carried over mountains when she sang." Sarah listened without jealousy, recognizing the importance of honoring what had come before. In turn, she shared fuller truths about her marriage to John, its initial passion that had gradually cooled into practical companionship, the disappointments of childlessness, the way they had grown apart even as they worked side by side. "I mourned him truly," she admitted, "but I think I also mourned the dream more than the reality. Does that make me terrible?" Kiantu shook his head. "Makes you honest. Dreams die harder than people sometimes." June brought the first visitors since Lancaster's warning. 3 women from town, Dorothy Mills, Martha Jenkins, and young Alice Foster, arrived one morning with baskets of preserves and obvious curiosity. Sarah met them in the yard, smoothing her apron with suddenly nervous hands. "We thought you might be in need of company," Dorothy explained, eyes darting past Sarah toward the cabin door. "Being so isolated and all." The real purpose of their visit hung unspoken between them. They had come to see the Indian husband, to confirm the whispered stories circulating through Whitetail Junction. "How thoughtful," Sarah said dryly. "Would you like some tea?" The women followed her inside, falling silent as they spotted Kiantu seated at the table, carefully repairing a leather bridle. He rose at their entrance, inclining his head in formal greeting but saying nothing. An awkward silence stretched until Martha Jenkins cleared her throat. "So this is your husband now?" "This is Kiantu," Sarah confirmed, emphasizing his name. "Yes, we're married." The women exchanged glances loaded with unspoken thoughts. Young Alice Foster, barely 17 and more direct than her elders, blurted, "Does he speak English? Can he understand us?" Before Sarah could respond, Kiantu answered in his measured, accented English. "I understand. I speak, not always perfectly, but enough." The frank response seemed to startle the women. They had clearly expected something more exotic, more threatening, perhaps. Instead, they were confronted with a man engaging in ordinary domestic tasks, speaking their language, existing comfortably in a space that looked remarkably like any settler's cabin. Sarah served tea, maintaining a deliberate air of normalcy. Gradually, the conversation evolved from stilted politeness to genuine interaction. Dorothy inquired about Sarah's expanded herb garden, visible through the window. Martha commented on the fine quality of Kiantu's leatherwork. Even Alice relaxed enough to ask how they had met, though Sarah provided only the barest outline of the truth, omitting the near-death circumstances and forced marriage. When the women eventually departed, promising to visit again soon, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching them retreat down the path toward town. "That went better than expected," she murmured as Kiantu joined her. "They came for stories to tell," he observed. "Left with fewer than hoped." Sarah smiled. "Disappointing, isn't it? No wild, savage-beating war drums, no helpless white captive. Just 2 people making a life together." Kiantu's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture that had become natural in recent weeks. Simple truth rarely satisfies those hungry for excitement. "Let them be hungry then," Sarah said, leaning against his solid warmth. "Our truth is ours alone." The women's visit marked a turning point in their relationship with the town. While outright acceptance remained elusive, The more lurid rumors gradually gave way to grudging tolerance. Sarah resumed trading at the general store when necessary, though she noted that some customers still kept their distance, mothers pulling children closer when Kiantu accompanied her. Their fear grows smaller, he observed after one such trip, like shadow at noon, still there but not so long. With each passing week, their lives intertwined more completely. Kiantu taught Sarah words from his language, names for plants and animals, expressions for weather patterns, endearments he whispered against her skin in the privacy of night. She showed him how to read more fluently, guiding his finger across pages of her few precious books, smiling as he discovered the pleasure of stories captured in written form. July brought scorching heat that baked the earth and drove them to swim in the creek's deeper pools, laughing like children as they splashed in the cool water. August filled their larder with the bounty of their combined knowledge, game preserved using his smoking techniques, vegetables canned according to her mother's recipes, wild berries dried on racks they had built together. "We make good partners," Sarah remarked one evening as they sorted the day's harvest of beans. "Better than I ever expected." Kiantu nodded thoughtfully. "Different knowledge makes a stronger whole, like your grafting, wild root, cultivated branches, both are needed." The metaphor pleased her, capturing something essential about their union. They were indeed like grafted plants, distinct in origin but growing together, producing something that neither could have created alone. As summer waned into early autumn, Sarah noticed subtle changes in her body. A new fullness to her breasts, unexpected fatigue in the afternoons, a peculiar sensitivity to certain smells. She recognized the signs from her brief pregnancy years before, though she kept the suspicion to herself, unwilling to voice hope until she was certain. By late September, there could be no doubt. Life had taken root within her, improbable, miraculous life born from their unlikely union. When she finally told Kiantu, they were harvesting the last of the season's apples, the trees heavy with red-gold fruit that caught the slanting autumn light. "I'm carrying a child," she said simply, one hand resting on her abdomen where no outward sign yet showed. "Our child." Kiantu went completely still, the apple in his hand forgotten. His eyes searched her face, then dropped to where her hand rested. "You are certain?" Sarah nodded. "About 3 months along, I think. The baby will come with spring." He sat down, his basket, and crossed to her, movements deliberate, as if approaching something fragile and precious. Hesitantly, almost reverently, he placed his hand beside hers. Though there was nothing yet to feel, his touch communicated everything words could not. Wonder, fear, fierce protective love already forming. "A child of 2 worlds," he murmured. "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "Neither fully one nor the other. Both, and something new entirely." Kiantu knelt suddenly before her, pressing his forehead against her still flat stomach in a gesture of such vulnerability that tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. He spoke in his native tongue, melodic sounds flowing together in what she recognized as a blessing or prayer. When he rose, his expression was transformed, the habitual reservation giving way to naked emotion. "My people believe children choose their parents before birth," he explained. "This spirit has chosen a difficult path, coming to us. We'll make it less difficult," Sarah promised. "We'll teach our child to walk in both worlds with pride." They finished the harvest in a kind of dazed joy, moving through familiar tasks while their minds spun with new possibilities, new concerns. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Kiantu traced patterns on Sarah's skin, naming their child. In multiple languages, imagining futures bright with promise and shadowed with potential hardship. "Things will change when the town learns," Sarah acknowledged, voicing the fear they both carried. "A child makes everything more real to them, more threatening perhaps." "Or more human," Kiantu countered. Children build bridges, adults cannot. The news of Sarah's pregnancy spread through Whitetail Junction with predictable ripples of shock, disapproval, and reluctant fascination. Some reactions were harsh. Reverend Schultz devoted an entire sermon to the dangers of mixing blood, though he carefully avoided naming Sarah directly. Others were surprisingly supportive. Dorothy Mills appeared one afternoon with a basket of baby linens and practical advice about morning sickness. Most significant was Lancaster's reaction. The sheriff rode out to their cabin on a crisp October day, his expression unreadable as he dismounted. "Heard the news," he said without preamble. "Thought we should talk." Sarah invited him inside, where Kiantu acknowledged him with formal courtesy. An uneasy silence stretched as Lancaster removed his hat, turning it in his hands as if searching for words. "A child changes things," he finally said, echoing Sarah's own thoughts from weeks earlier. "Makes certain matters more pressing." "What matters?" Sarah asked cautiously. Lancaster set his hat on the table with deliberate care. "Legal matters. Your child's status, specifically." Kiantu straightened, a hint of tension visible in his shoulders. "Explain." "Territory law is complicated when it comes to children of mixed parentage." The sheriff looked uncomfortable but pressed on. "There's been talk in town, questions about inheritance rights, citizenship." Sarah's protective instincts flared. "Our child will be born on American soil to legally married parents, one of whom is undisputedly a citizen. What more is there to discuss?" Lancaster held up a placating hand. "I'm not here to challenge that. In fact, I'm here to help secure it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "This is a legal recognition of your marriage, properly filed with territorial authorities. And this," he produced a second paper, "is a document acknowledging Kiantu as a legal resident under the marriage statute." Sarah took the papers with surprise. "Why are you doing this?" The sheriff's weathered face softened slightly. "I've been enforcing law in these parts for 15 years. Seen plenty of injustice done in the name of fear. Don't always have the power to prevent it." He glanced at Kiantu. "Still don't much understand your choices, Mrs. Blackwood, but a child deserves protection under law, whatever its parentage." After Lancaster departed, Sarah and Kiantu examined the documents together. Official recognition of what they had forged between them, protection for the life growing within her. "Paper means little in itself," Kiantu observed, "but what it represents, security," Sarah finished, "or as much as we can hope for." The pregnancy progressed through the deepening autumn. Sarah's body changed, rounding with new life, while Kiantu worked tirelessly to prepare for winter, stockpiling firewood, reinforcing the barn roof, smoking additional meat. His protective instincts, always present, intensified with each passing week. He insisted on accompanying her wherever she went, eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. One evening, as the first snow dusted the mountains, Sarah sat mending by the fire while Kiantu carved a small wooden figure, a bear, its form emerging from the cedar block in his skilled hands. "For the baby," he explained when he caught her watching. "First of many animal guides." Sarah smiled, touched by his connection. To traditions she was only beginning to understand. "Will you teach our child about your people's ways, the stories and beliefs?" Kiantu's hands stilled momentarily. "If you wish it." "I do," she said firmly. "I want our child to know both heritages, mine and yours, to walk with feet in both worlds, but heart belonging to neither exclusively." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "A difficult path, but perhaps a stronger one." "Like the grafted apple tree," Sarah suggested, returning to his earlier metaphor, "taking strength from diverse roots." Kiantu resumed his carving, the knife moving with deliberate precision. "The tree knows nothing of the boundaries men create. It grows where planted, reaches for the same sun, whether in white man's orchard or Apache mountainside. As winter settled once more over Whitetail Valley, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. 12 months earlier, she had been alone, a widow merely surviving rather than living. Now her home hummed with shared purpose. Her body nurtured new life, and her heart had found connection she had never imagined possible. The cabin that had once felt suffocatingly empty now seemed perfectly sized for their growing family. The silence that had haunted her had transformed into a comfortable quietude, punctuated by meaningful conversation. Even the harsh mountain winter, which had once seemed an enemy to be endured, now felt like a cocoon protecting their private world while they prepared for spring's transformations. One night, as snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside their window, Keantu placed his hand on Sarah's rounded belly and felt their child move for the first time. His expression of wonder transcended language, cultural differences momentarily insignificant. In the face of this primordial miracle, life finds a way, he whispered, an echo of wisdom shared months earlier. Like water around stone. Sarah covered his hand with hers, feeling the bridge their child formed between them. Physical, emotional, spiritual. Not around, she corrected gently. Through. Life finds a way through stone, given enough time and persistence. Keantu nodded, understanding her meaning. They were not merely adapting to obstacles, flowing around resistance. They were transforming the landscape itself, carving new possibilities through seemingly immovable barriers. As December's darkness gathered around their homestead, they faced the future with hard-won confidence. The path ahead held uncertainties. How their child would be received in town, whether larger social forces would eventually intrude upon their haven. What challenges awaited a family that defied easy categorization. Yet beneath these concerns lay a bedrock of certainty. They had chosen each other, forged connection from circumstance, and created new life that embodied their shared journey. Whatever came with spring's arrival, they would meet it together. Not as Apache and settler, not as reluctant allies bound by necessity, but as partners who had discovered that love, like water, recognizes no boundaries created by human fear. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white that revealed no distinctions, acknowledged no divisions. Inside, firelight flickered over two figures seated close together, hands intertwined, waiting for winter to complete its work so that spring could begin anew. "We're offering to purchase your land at fair market value," Lancaster continued. "Provide transportation and supplies for relocation before the baby comes. Help you establish yourselves somewhere your child might grow up with less scrutiny." The offer hung in the air between them. Sarah looked to Keantu, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though she could read the complex emotions behind his calm exterior. "This is our home," she said finally. "We've committed to making it work here." "Think practically, Sarah," Dr. Pierce urged. "Your child would grow up isolated, caught between worlds. In this other settlement, there would be children like him, people who understand the unique challenges. Or we could simply remain and help Whitetail Junction learn that tolerance," Sarah countered. "Be the change rather than avoiding the challenge." Lancaster sighed. "I admire your courage, but consider this from all angles. The territory's changing. Armies pushing harder against remaining Apache bands. Tensions are high. Your husband," he nodded toward Keantu, "will always be viewed with suspicion here, no matter what legal papers say. That suspicion will extend to your child." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the unavoidable truth in them despite her determination. She looked to Keantu, whose dark eyes met hers steadily. "We will discuss," he said to the men. "Private conversation between husband and wife." Lancaster nodded, understanding the dismissal. We'll expect your answer in 2 weeks. The offer is genuine, Sarah, made from concern, not malice. After the men departed, silence filled the cabin. Sarah moved to the window, watching their retreating figures until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did she turn to Chiantu. "Would you go?" she asked directly. "If I agreed." He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "My people have always known when to move with the seasons, when to seek new hunting grounds. Survival sometimes means leaving familiar places." "That's not an answer," Sarah pressed. "No," he acknowledged. "Truth is, I would go where you and the child go. My home is not this land anymore. It is you." The simple declaration struck Sarah deeply. She crossed to him and took his hands in hers. "And if I said I want to stay, to fight for our right to live here, to raise our child where my roots are?" Chiantu's expression was grave. "Then we stay and fight. But consider carefully what battle we choose for our child. Some struggles strengthen, others only wound." That night, as wind rattled the shutters and moonlight cast silver patterns across their bed, Sarah lay awake weighing possibilities. Each choice carried consequences she could only partially predict. Remaining meant daily resistance, raising a child who would face prejudice from earliest awareness. Leaving meant surrender in one sense, but perhaps victory in another, the freedom to build a life unencumbered by constant judgment. "What is the right path is not always clear," Chiantu murmured, sensing her wakefulness. "Sometimes many right paths, each with a different destination." Sarah turned toward him in the darkness. "Tell me what you truly want, not what you'll accept for my sake." He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke. "I want our child to know pride, not shame, to run free without fear, to learn both our ways without having to hide either." His hand found her belly in the darkness. "I want more than survival. I want living." "Then we need to see this place Lancaster described," Sarah decided, "before we choose." The journey northwest tested Sarah's endurance. Despite Lancaster arranging a wagon and Chiantu fashioning extra padding for the rough roads, each jolt sent discomfort through her heavily pregnant body. They traveled slowly, taking 4 days to cover ground that would normally require 2. The valley gradually gave way to more open terrain. Rolling hills dotted with pine stands, streams cutting through meadows, still winter brown, but showing the first hint of green beneath. The settlement, when they finally reached it, surprised them both. Nestled in a protected basin, New Haven, as the crude signpost proclaimed it, consisted of perhaps 30 structures, log cabins mostly, with a few more substantial frame buildings that housed a general store, small church, and schoolhouse. Children played in the central common area, their appearance immediately notable to Sarah's searching eyes. Many showed mixed heritage clearly: copper skin with light eyes, dark hair with European features. Lancaster had arranged for them to meet with the settlement's unofficial leader, a former army scout named Thomas Byrne, who had married a Shoshone woman 20 years earlier. The grizzled frontiersman welcomed them to his comfortable home, where his wife, Morning Flower, served coffee and freshly baked bread. "Word reached us you might be coming," Byrne said without preamble. "Lancaster's letter said you're in need of a fresh start." Sarah glanced at Chiantu, who sat observing their hosts with careful attention. "We're exploring possibilities," she clarified. "Our child will arrive soon, and we want to make the best choice for his future." Morning Flower smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Children need belonging," she said, her English accented but clear. "Need to see others like themselves. Not always easy path, but easier when shared." Over the next 2 days, Sarah and Chiantu explored the settlement, speaking with residents and observing the rhythms of daily life. They witnessed a community where cultural differences were not just tolerated, but incorporated, where the school taught children in multiple languages, where traditional knowledge from various tribes was valued alongside European learning. The women gather twice monthly to share skills, explained Rachel Two Rivers, whose father had been Crow and mother German. I've learned quilting patterns from Kentucky and beadwork from 3 different tribes. Children grow up seeing beauty in all traditions. Not everything was idyllic, of course. They heard stories of prejudice from traveling traders, of children who occasionally faced cruelty when venturing to larger towns. But there was a resilience here, born from shared experience, a support system that cushioned such blows. On their final evening, as they sat beside a community bonfire, Sarah felt the baby shift within her. The movement seemed symbolic somehow, new life positioning itself for emergence into a world that would both welcome and challenge it. She looked at Kiantu, firelight playing across his strong features, and found him watching her with an expression of rare openness. "You've decided," he said, not questioning. She nodded slowly. "Have you?" "Yes," he replied simply. They spoke simultaneously. "We should stay in Whitetail. This place could be home." They broke off, staring at each other in surprise that quickly dissolved into laughter. Genuine shared amusement at their crossed purposes after days of careful consideration. "You want to return?" Kiantu asked, once their laughter subsided. Sarah sighed, looking around at the peaceful gathering. "Part of me does. It's where I've lived for so long, where I buried my first husband, where we found each other. Leaving feels like surrender. And the other part knows that this," she gestured to the diverse families surrounding them, "is what our child deserves. Not isolation, not constant battle, but community, belonging." Kiantu nodded slowly. "My thoughts are also divided. Warrior in me says fight for our right to live wherever we choose. Father in me says give the child the easiest path possible." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. Around them, conversations flowed in multiple languages. Children dozed against parents' shoulders, and the easy familiarity of people who had chosen to build something together, despite differences, permeated the gathering. Perhaps the strongest. "Choice is knowing when not to fight," Kiantu said finally, "when to find better ground." Sarah reached for his hand. "So we stay here?" "We make new home," he corrected gently. "Not just stay, build." The decision once made brought unexpected peace. They returned to Whitetail Valley only long enough to finalize arrangements. Lancaster helped negotiate a fair price for Sarah's land and homestead. The community, perhaps relieved by their departure, proved generous in settling accounts. Sarah said farewell to the cabin with mixed emotions, gratitude for all it had witnessed, sadness at leaving, hope for what lay ahead. They reached New Haven just as the first true signs of spring emerged across the landscape. Green shoots pushed through softening earth, birdsong filled the warming air. The community welcomed their return with practical assistance, helping establish them in a small cabin at the settlement's edge, bringing necessities for the coming birth, incorporating them into the shared work of planting season. Sarah's labor began on a perfect April morning, just as dawn painted the eastern hills with golden light. Morning Flower and 3 other women with midwifery experience came immediately. Kiantu, unlike most men of either culture, refused to be displaced from the birthing room, insisting on supporting Sarah through each wave of pain. "Our child comes into the world with both parents witnessing," he stated with quiet authority, when one older woman tried to shoo him outside. "This is the Apache way." The birth itself was difficult but uncomplicated. As the sun reached its zenith, Sarah delivered a robust son, whose first cry filled the cabin with a fierce, life-affirming sound. The women cleaned and swaddled him, while Chiantu supported an exhausted but triumphant Sarah. When they placed the infant in her arms, she gazed in wonder at the perfect blending of their features. Skin a warm copper gold, a dusting of black hair, eyes whose shape mirrored hers, though their color remained the newborn blue that might get darkened to match his father's. In Apache tradition, Chiantu said softly, child receives a name after showing character. Until then, is called simply baby or little one. Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom in waiting for the person to emerge before assigning a permanent identity. But we'll know, she whispered, even without saying it aloud. In her heart, she already felt the name forming, not English, not Apache, but something that honored both heritages while acknowledging the unique path this child would walk. A name that spoke of bridges between worlds, of new beginnings carved from difficult circumstances, of hope that transcended boundaries created by fear. As afternoon light spilled through the cabin window, illuminating the three of them in its golden glow, Sarah felt the completion of a journey that had begun on that snow-swept day when she had found a wounded stranger at the edge of her property. What had started as reluctant mercy had transformed through seasons of growth into something neither could have imagined, a family forged across divides of culture and background, strengthened by difference rather than diminished by it. Outside, the settlement hummed with spring activity. Gardens being planted, livestock grazing new grass, children's voices carrying on the warm breeze. Inside, a new family rested in the quiet aftermath of creation, their future unwritten but rich with possibility. We are home, Chiantu said simply, his hand covering hers where it cradled their son. Sarah smiled, exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the perfection of this moment. Yes, she agreed, finally home. The child between them stirred, tiny fingers grasping reflexively at the air. In that small movement lay all the promise and challenge of the path ahead, a life that would never fit neatly into the categories others might attempt to impose, but would instead forge its own way through the wilderness of human experience, like water shaping stone, like roots finding soil between rocks, like love crossing boundaries never meant to be traversed, like life itself, persistent, adaptable, and ultimately unstoppable in its journey toward light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.